In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who was told officers die fast in the Imperial Guard, and only later learned that some of them are meant to. He's been promoted 5 times in 11 months. 5 times he stepped into a dead man's authority, wore his rank, sent orders through Vox channels, still warm with his voice. Each promotion is a man in the ground. He has started to suspect that is not an accident. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Hurn Raddow, who was not born for command, he was born for breaking clinker. On his hive world, the great smelting furnaces cool every 60 days, and the molten slag hardens into a substance that fuses to the walls and has to be broken out by hand before the next firing. So men go in while the metal is still hot enough to blister skin through a suit with a pry bar and a pneumatic ram, and the furnace does not care whether you are still inside when it reignites. The schedule is the schedule. He did that for 11 years. It taught him 2 things: how to read a thing that wants to kill you before it reads you, and that complaining about what you cannot change is wasted air. Then the tithe ships came, and he traded one furnace for another. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
They told me officers die fast in the Imperial Guard. What they never mentioned was that some of them are meant to.
I know that now. I know it the way you know the weight of a tool you've held too long, something that stopped being a thought and became a condition of your hands. I have been promoted 5 times in 11 months on Hrothgal Minoris. 5 times I've stepped into a dead man's authority, worn his rank, inherited his problems, sent orders through Vox channels still warm with his voice. 5 times the Departamento Munitorum has stamped a new designation beside my name, and 5 times the man whose designation I took was already in the ground, or what passed for a ground on that miserable rock. My name is Hurn Raddow. I was not born for command. I was born for breaking clinker. If you don't know what a clinker-breaker does, I'll tell you in the simplest terms I can, because it matters. On Morthax Secundus, where I drew my first breath in a hab block so deep in the mid-hive that natural light was a rumor, the great smelting furnaces run day and night, year after year, century after century. They process ore into raw material for the forge temples above. When the furnaces cool for their maintenance cycles, every 60 to 90 days, depending on the schedule and the whims of the overseers, the molten slag inside solidifies into a substance called clinker. It fuses to the furnace walls, the grates, the heat exchangers, and it has to be broken apart and cleared before the next firing cycle. That's what clinker breakers do. You go in while the furnace is still hot enough to blister your skin through your suit. You take a pneumatic ram and a pry bar, and you break the clinker off, piece by piece, slab by slab, in temperatures that will cook you if you stay too long. The furnace doesn't care whether you're inside when it reignites. The schedule is the schedule. You break what you can and you get out. And if you left some behind, they dock your ration shit and send you back in next cycle. I broke clinker for 11 years, from the age of 12 until the day the tithe ships came for the 47th Morthaxian Line Infantry and took me with them. In those 11 years, I learned 2 things that kept me alive. The first was how to read the condition of a thing that wanted to kill me. A furnace has moods. You learn its sounds, its colors, the way the metal sings when it's cooling unevenly, the spots where the clinker is thinnest and the heat is still trapped behind it like a fist waiting to open. You learn to read the danger before it reads you. The second thing I learned was that complaining about circumstances you cannot change is wasted air, and wasted air will kill you in an enclosed space. So I stopped complaining early, and I haven't started again since. The tithe came on a gray morning in the middle of a work cycle. Overseers pulled us off the furnace floor and lined us up in the yard outside Smelter Block 18, and a woman in a crisp uniform I'd never seen before walked down the line, pointing at every third person. I was a third person. That was the entire recruitment process. No questions asked, no aptitude tested, no medical examination beyond a servitor pressing a sensor to my chest and registering a pulse. I was handed a tin-stamped conscription marker loaded onto a transport and shipped to a mustering field on the surface of Morthax that I hadn't seen since I was 6 years old. The sky was a flat, orange-brown thing choked with chemical haze, and I remember thinking it looked exactly like the inside of a cooling furnace, and that I'd traded one for another. Basic training lasted 4 months. It should have lasted 6, but the 47th had suffered losses on their previous deployment and needed replacements fast. The training was exactly what you'd expect if you know anything about the Guard. They taught us how to fire a las rifle, how to fix a bayonet, how to dig a foxhole, how to march in formation, and how to die in an orderly fashion. That last one they didn't teach in any formal lesson. You just absorbed it from everything else. The drills, the punishments, the way the instructors talked about casualties, the way the foreman back home talked about furnace lining. Consumable, replaceable, expected. I was assigned to 3rd Platoon, 8th Company, under a corporal named Trosk. Trosk was Morthaxian, like most of the enlisted. He had a face like a clenched fist, and he chewed stim root constantly, even during drill, even during inspection, which should have earned him a flogging, but never did, because Trosk had a quality that made him invaluable in the Guard. He was stupid in exactly the right way. Not so stupid that he'd get you killed through incompetence, but stupid enough that he never questioned orders, never hesitated, never second-guessed the chain of command. He was the perfect corporal. He moved when told, stopped when told, and transmitted orders down the line with the reliability of a well-maintained servitor. I liked Trosk, not in any meaningful sense of the word, the way you'd like a friend or a brother, but in the way you like a wall that keeps the rain off. He was solid, and he was there, and he didn't ask you to be anything more than what you were. My squad was 8 men and women. Pachev, who was loud and heavy-shouldered and told lies about women he'd been with back on Morthax that no one believed but everyone tolerated because they passed the time. Fennec, who was old for a conscript, maybe 45, and who had the quiet, settled demeanor of a man who'd already survived things worse than anything the Guard could throw at him. Brose Elim, who spoke so rarely that I sometimes forgot she was there until I saw her las rifle flash in the fighting line, always precise, always on target. There were 5 others whose names and faces I carry with me still, but they matter less to this story than the ones who died first, so I'll spare you the introductions. We shipped out for Hrothgal Minoris aboard a troop transport called the Vow of Sufferance, and the name should have told us everything we needed to know. Hrothgal Minoris was a world at war, and it had been at war for 9 years before we arrived. The planet was mostly rock and scrubland, cold in the way that gets into your joints and stays there, with mountain ranges that ran north to south like the spine of some vast dead animal. The enemy was human. Renegade planetary defense forces, augmented by cult militias and, if the briefings were to be believed, elements of chaos-touched warbands that had filtered in from the nearby Draven Rift. They held the eastern mountain chains and the fortified cities within them, and our job was to push them out. 9 years of war had produced a front line that moved in meters, not kilometers,
and the 47th was being fed into this meat grinder alongside 11 other regiments to try to break the stalemate. Our first engagement was on the Hrothgal Plateau, a flat, windswept expanse of gray rock that stretched between two mountain ridges. We were ordered to advance across it toward a series of enemy emplacements dug into the ridge face on the far side. There was no cover on the plateau, not a rock, not a fold in the ground, not a depression deep enough to shelter a rat. The briefing said we'd have armored support. The armor never came. Something about a supply route being contested further south, an issue with fuel allocations, the kind of explanation that means nothing when you're walking into open fire. We stepped off at dawn, and the enemy began firing before we'd covered 100 meters. Heavy bolter positions dug in and zeroed on the open ground we had to cross. The sound was unlike anything training had prepared me for. Not the crack of individual shots, but a continuous rolling pressure of noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a physical force that pushed against your chest and made your teeth ache. Men started falling immediately. Not dramatically, not like in the propaganda reels where a soldier clutches his chest and sinks to his knees with a final prayer to the emperor on his lips. They just dropped. One step they were walking, the next they were on the ground, and the line moved past them the way water moves past a stone. Trosk was ahead of me by 3 meters, chewing his stim root, his las rifle braced against his shoulder, though we were still too far out for effective return fire. A burst from an autocannon position caught him across the midsection. I saw it happen. One moment he was there, solid and reliable as a wall, and the next he was in 2 pieces, and the pieces were falling in different directions, and his stim root was still between his teeth in the upper half, and I was stepping over him because the line was moving and stopping meant dying. We lost 43 soldiers in that advance, 43 out of 120 in our company's section. The emplacements were eventually suppressed by a flanking action from 9th Company, 3 hours after we'd begun the advance. 3 hours of walking into fire across open rock with nothing to hide behind and nowhere to go but forward. By the time we reached the ridge, the survivors were shaking so badly that most couldn't hold their rifles steady, and I was a corporal. The promotion came that evening. A lieutenant I hadn't met before, a thin man with a pinched face, whose name I later learned was Holt, walked down the line of survivors and pointed at me. He said, "You, Trosk's replacement, file the papers with company command." That was it. No ceremony, no commendation, no words of encouragement. I was a corporal because the man who'd held the rank before me had been cut in half by an autocannon, and I happened to be standing closest to where he'd fallen. I filed the papers. A clerk servitor stamped them. The Departamento Munitorum processed my new rank, and somewhere on a data slate in a hab on a ship in orbit, my designation changed from guardsman to corporal, and the universe did not so much as blink. I wish I could tell you I felt something. Pride, maybe, or fear, or the weight of responsibility that stories about war like to emphasize. What I felt was the same thing I'd felt in the furnaces back on Morthax when a section of clinker broke loose and revealed a fresh pocket of heat beneath it. Assessment, new responsibilities, new risks, new angles of danger to read and account for. I was a corporal. I had a squad. And the campaign on Hrothgal Minoris was only beginning. The weeks that followed the Hrothgal Plateau taught me what the Imperial Guard actually was, beneath the propaganda and the hymns and the Aquila-stamped banners. It was a machine for converting human bodies into territorial gains, and the conversion rate was appalling. We advanced, we dug in, we were shelled, we advanced again. The enemy was entrenched, fanatical, and supplied through underground tunnel networks that our intelligence couldn't map and our artillery couldn't reach. Every position we took cost us men we couldn't replace. Every position we lost cost us men to take it back.
The front line on our section moved forward by perhaps 2 kilometers in those first 6 weeks, and it cost 8th Company 60% of its original strength to achieve it. I lost 3 of my squad in the first month. Pachev took a sniper round through the throat during a resupply run. A stupid death in a stupid place, walking between 2 trenches in what should have been a safe corridor. The sniper had found an angle no one had thought to check, and Pachev was loud and tall and made an easy target. Fenok died in a tunnel breach when the enemy sappers blew a section of our trench line from below and the ground opened up beneath his feet. He didn't even have time to shout. And one of the others, a young man named Call, stepped on an unexploded shell during a night advance and ceased to exist in a flash of white light that left a ringing in my ears for 3 days afterward. Their replacements came from the reserve pool, men and women pulled from other shattered squads and slotted into the gaps like replacement parts in a machine. I didn't learn their names immediately. I called them by their designations until they proved they'd last long enough to warrant remembering, and some of them did, and some of them didn't. Brose Elim lasted. She was still there, quiet and precise, her las rifle always clean, her section of the trench always tidy. She never spoke about the dead. She never spoke about much of anything. But she shot with an accuracy that bordered on mechanical, and in the guard that was worth more than eloquence. The second promotion came 7 weeks into the campaign. Our platoon sergeant, a woman named Morvain, who'd served with the 47th for 6 years and survived 2 prior deployments, was killed during an assault on a fortified bunker complex designated Bastion Ulmar. The assault was a mess from the start. The preliminary bombardment fell short and hit our staging position instead of the enemy's, killing 11 of our own before we'd even begun to move. Then the order came to advance anyway, because the timetable said advance, and the timetable didn't know or care that our own shells had just landed on our heads. Morvain led the charge. She was good at it. She had a way of running that made you want to follow, not because she inspired you, but because she moved with such certainty that your body followed hers before your mind had time to object. She cleared the first trench line, rallied the platoon at the second, and was organizing the push on the bunker itself, when a last bolt from a position we thought had been cleared hit her in the side of the head. She went down like her strings had been cut. No sound, no final words. One moment leading, the next moment gone. I was the senior corporal. The designation passed to me the same way Trosk's had, through the simple arithmetic of who was still alive. Lieutenant Holt confirmed it over the Vox, his thin voice crackling through the static. "Raddow, you have the platoon. Take the bunker." So I took the platoon, and we took the bunker, and 14 more people died in the doing of it, and by the time we held Bastion Ulmar, I was Sergeant Raddow of 3rd Platoon, 8th Company, 47th Morthaxian Line Infantry. The paperwork was filed. The Munitorum stamped it. And I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before, something small and probably meaningless. Or so I told myself at the time. When the confirmation came through on the company data slate, it was co-signed by 2 names. The first was Lieutenant Holt, which was expected. The second was an adept of the Departamento Munitorum named Kiel Surat, whom I had never met, never seen, and never heard of until that moment. I filed the observation away the way I'd file away a hairline fracture in furnace lining. Not critical yet, but worth watching. The 3rd month on Hrothgal Minoris was when the war stopped being a series of bad days and became a single, unbroken experience of attrition. The mountains swallowed men the way furnaces swallowed fuel, and the output was the same: ash and waste and the faint, lingering warmth of something that had once been useful.
We pushed deeper into the eastern ranges, following valleys that funneled us into kill zones, crossing rivers that ran brown with runoff from the fighting further north, digging into positions that we knew we'd have to abandon within days because the front was always shifting, always hungry, always demanding more from us than we had to give. The supply situation was the first thing I noticed as a sergeant that I hadn't noticed as a corporal or a guardsman. When you're at the bottom of the chain, supplies are either there or they aren't, and you don't think about why. When you're a sergeant, you start to see the mechanics. You see the requisition forms, the allocation tables, the distribution schedules. And what I saw didn't make sense. We were short on everything. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, replacement parts for our lasguns, power cells, entrenching tools, water purification tablets. The shortages weren't catastrophic, not yet, but they were persistent and worsening. Every resupply drop brought less than the last one. Every requisition I filed came back either partially filled or stamped with a delay notice, citing logistical constraints. I'd been breaking clinker long enough to know what it looked like when a system was failing from the inside, and the supply chain smelled like a furnace running on borrowed time. But then something strange would happen. After a particularly bad stretch of fighting, after a battle that cost us an officer or two, the supplies would come. Not a full allocation, not the abundance of a properly functioning logistics train, but enough. A crate of power cells that arrived the day after Lieutenant Holt reported the death of a platoon leader. Ration packs that materialized in the company stores 48 hours after a Commissariat execution of a junior officer accused of dereliction. Medical supplies that appeared, addressed specifically to our company, within a week of our previous company commander taking a mortar fragment to the chest and dying on the operating table. I noticed it. I didn't say anything about it. Noticing things and talking about things are two very different activities in the Imperial Guard, and only one of them will get you killed. The war went on. We fought through a valley called the Madrak Corridor that earned its nickname of the Gut because of the way it narrowed and twisted and squeezed the life out of anything that entered it. The enemy had fortified both walls with overlapping fire positions, and our advance through it was measured in bodies. Every 100 meters cost a squad. Every kilometer cost a platoon. And at the far end of the Gut, where the valley opened into a basin that our strategists had designated as a staging area for the next phase of the campaign, there was a fortress called the Hrekin Fastness, and taking it was our regiment's assigned objective. The assault on the Hrekin Fastness was set for the 5th month. In the weeks leading up to it, the regiment was reorganized. Depleted companies were merged. Shattered platoons were folded together. New officers were shuffled into positions vacated by the dead, and the dead were numerous. By this point, 8th Company had lost its original captain, one of its 2 lieutenants, 4 of its 6 sergeants, and roughly 70% of its enlisted strength. We were reinforced by survivors from 12th Company, which had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit after an ambush in the Northern Pass, and I found myself commanding a platoon that was half strangers. It was during this reorganization that I first met Commissar Wex Sulo. Sulo was not attached to our company originally. He'd been assigned to 3rd Battalion as a whole, but the previous commissar for 8th Company had died, shot through the back during a retreat that the official record classified as a tactical withdrawal, and Sulo had taken over his duties along with his own. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who burned calories through constant, nervous energy. His uniform was immaculate despite the conditions, pressed and clean in a way that shouldn't have been possible in the field, but somehow was, and his cap sat on his head at a precise angle that never varied regardless of wind, rain, or incoming fire. His face was narrow, his eyes were pale, and his mouth was a thin, compressed line that rarely opened, except to issue orders or pronouncements. I disliked him immediately, not with passion or anger, but with the flat, practical dislike of a man who recognizes a hazard in his working environment and adjusts his behavior accordingly. Sullo was the kind of commissar who watched. He stood at the edges of briefings, at the back of assembly formations, at the mouth of trenches during bombardments. And he watched. He watched the way men reacted, the way they moved, the way they flinched or didn't flinch. He was reading us the way I used to read furnace walls, looking for weaknesses, for cracks, for the places where the heat was building behind a thin shell of apparent stability. The other figure who became prominent during this period was Adet Gil Surat. I finally met him in person at a logistics briefing that I attended as a platoon sergeant, one of the few enlisted present. Surat was a functionary of the Departamento Munitorum, assigned to the 47th as a logistical liaison. He was small, round-shouldered, with skin the color of old parchment, and eyes that sat deep in his skull behind a pair of augmetic lenses that whirred and clicked when he focused on something. He carried a data slate the way some men carry weapons, always in hand, always ready. And he referenced it constantly, scrolling through columns of figures with a fingertip that moved with the precision of an autoscribe. Surat spoke rarely, and when he spoke, it was in numbers. Battalion strength, 412 effective, down from 609 at deployment. Ammunition expenditure, 14% above projected rates. Ration consumption within acceptable parameters, assuming continued attrition reduces mouths to feed. He said that last part without inflection, without emphasis, the way you'd note a favorable weather forecast. Attrition reduces mouths to feed. I remember those words because they were the first time I heard someone express the death of soldiers as a budgetary advantage, spoken aloud and without shame, in a room full of the soldiers in question. Nobody reacted. Nobody challenged it. This was the Imperial Guard. This was how it worked. The assault on the Hrekan fastness was launched on the first day of our 5th month on Hrothgal Minoris, and it was the worst thing I had experienced up to that point, which is saying something given what the previous 4 months had contained. The fastness was a mountain fortress built into the rock face of a peak called Hrekan's Tooth, a jagged spire of black stone that rose above the basin like a broken fang. The renegades had dug into it over 9 years of occupation, turning natural caves and mining tunnels into a labyrinth of defensive positions that went deep into the mountain. Our approach was across the basin floor, which was open ground, then up a series of switchback trails carved into the mountainside, which were killing grounds. The plan called for a preliminary bombardment from the regiment's Basilisk battery, followed by a massed infantry assault from 3 companies, 8th included, supported by 2 Chimera transports that had been promised from Divisional Reserve. The bombardment went well. The basilisks pounded the mountain face for 2 hours, sending plumes of rock and dust into the sky and presumably causing havoc within the enemy positions. But the Chimeras never arrived. Again, supply issues, fuel allocation, competing priorities. I was beginning to see a pattern in these explanations, the way you see a pattern in furnace clinker when the same formation keeps appearing in the same spot, cycle after cycle. Something in the system was producing these failures, and it wasn't random. We went in on foot, 3 companies, roughly 400 soldiers, advancing across open ground and then climbing a mountain under fire. The enemy had survived the bombardment better than our planners had predicted because they always did, because 9 years of digging had given them positions deep enough to weather anything short of an orbital strike, which nobody was willing to authorize for a single mountain on a minor world in a war that most of the sector had already forgotten about. The climb was butchery. The switchbacks funneled us into single-file columns that the enemy raked with enfilading fire from prepared positions. Men fell and their bodies rolled back down the trail and tripped the men behind them. Every turn in the trail was a killing ground. Every stretch of open rock was a shooting gallery. 8th Company lost its acting captain, a man named Sten, who'd been promoted to the position only 2 weeks prior after the previous captain's death, within the first hour of the assault. He was leading from the front, as company commanders in the 47th were expected to do, and a heavy stubber round took him through the chest and sent him tumbling down the mountainside. I watched him fall, bouncing off rocks, his limbs loose and wrong, until the trail curved and I lost sight of him. Lieutenant Halt took command of the company. He lasted 3 hours. A grenade thrown from an upper position landed in the command group's midst during a halt to reorganize. Halt and 2 of his aides were killed instantly. The blast threw me sideways into a rock wall, and I lay there for a moment with my ears ringing and my vision swimming. And when I got back up, I was the senior surviving NCO in what remained of 8th Company. The assault eventually succeeded. Not because of our skill or our bravery, but because we had more bodies to throw at the mountain than the enemy had ammunition to stop us. That's the ugly truth of Imperial Guard warfare that no one puts in the histories. We won through arithmetic. We won because we were more willing to accept losses than they were, or rather, because the people making our decisions were more willing, and we were not consulted on the matter. When the fighting ended and the Hrekin fastness was secured, I sat in a captured enemy bunker that smelled of blood and last discharge and something chemical that burned the back of my throat. And a runner found me there and handed me a data slate with my promotion on it. Sergeant Raddow was now Lieutenant Raddow. The order bore 2 signatures. The regimental colonel, a man named Draven, whom I'd never spoken to directly, and Adept Gil Suret. I looked at that second name for a long time. A Munitorum adept co-signing a field promotion was unusual. Not unheard of, but unusual. The Munitorum handled logistics, supply, and personnel records. They processed promotions after the fact, stamped them, filed them. They didn't co-sign them. Co-signing implied involvement in the decision, not just the paperwork. It implied that Surat had a say in who got promoted and when. I filed this observation alongside the first one, 2 hairline fractures running parallel. The weeks after the Hrekin fastness were supposed to be a consolidation period. We held the mountain, fortified it, and used it as a base for pushing further into the eastern ranges. Replacements trickled in, never enough, never fast enough, but enough to keep the companies functional. The fighting shifted from massed assaults to patrol actions, skirmishes, ambushes. Smaller scale, but no less deadly. The enemy was adapting, pulling back from fixed positions and fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains, striking at our supply lines and vanishing back into the tunnels. It was during this period that I began to pay closer attention to who was dying and how. As a lieutenant, I had access to the company's casualty reports and the daily briefings from battalion command. I could see the patterns that had been invisible to me as a corporal or a sergeant. And the patterns were there. They were unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Officers were dying at a higher rate than enlisted. That by itself wasn't unusual. Officers lead from the front in the guard. They're visible, they're targeted, they carry better equipment that makes them stand out. But the disparity on Hrothgal Minoris was extreme. In the 5 months since our deployment, 8th Company had lost 100% of its original officer cadre. Every single one, every captain, every lieutenant, every senior sergeant. All dead. Replaced, promoted, dead again. Replaced again. The enlisted losses were severe, 70%, but that still left 30% of the original conscripts alive. Among officers, the survival rate was 0. The daily briefings carried strength returns for the other companies in the battalion, and once I knew what to look for, the same pattern was there. 7th Company, 100% officer casualties. 9th Company, 94%. 10th Company, 100%. And in each case, the pattern was the same. Officers dying in circumstances that were explicable individually, but that formed a trend when viewed together. Killed in assaults that were ordered at the last minute without adequate preparation. Killed in positions that were overrun due to supply shortages that prevented adequate fortification. Killed leading patrols that were routed through areas known to be dangerous, on intelligence that later proved to be outdated or fabricated. Any one of these deaths could be attributed to the chaos of war. Bad luck, bad timing, the randomness of combat. But all of them, every single original officer in every single company. I sat with those numbers in my bunker, and I felt the same thing I'd felt standing in a cooling furnace when the clinker looked wrong, when the patterns in the slag told me something beneath was hotter than it should be, something pressurized and dangerous and waiting. Something was rotten in the 47th Morthaxian, and I was standing right on top of it. I want to be clear about something. I am not a detective. I am not an investigator. I am not one of those protagonists from the stories they sell in the hive markets, the ones who notice a single thread out of place and pull it until the whole conspiracy unravels in a neat sequence of revelations. I'm a clinker-breaker who learned to read furnaces, and what I was reading in the 47th Morthaxian was the same thing I'd have read in a furnace with a cracked heat exchanger. Pressure building in a place it shouldn't be, heat where the system says there should be none. The preconditions for a catastrophic failure, invisible from the outside but obvious from the inside, if you knew what to look for. But knowing something is wrong and understanding what is wrong are different things, and the second took me longer than I'd like to admit. The next piece fell into place during a resupply operation in our 7th month. I'd been a lieutenant for 2 months by then, commanding what was left of 3rd Platoon plus remnants of 1st and 2nd that had been folded in. We were holding a forward position in a valley called the Grenthar Pass, a narrow defile between 2 ridges that served as the main supply route to our frontline units in the eastern mountains. My job was to keep the pass open. The enemy's job was to close it. We spent our days repairing the road after mortar attacks and our nights fighting off raiding parties that came down from the ridges to plant mines and cut our wire. It was during one of these resupply runs that I found myself in the regimental logistics depot, a collection of prefab structures and cargo containers set up in a natural cave at the western mouth of the pass. I was there to argue about ammunition allocations. My platoon was burning through power cells faster than our allotment covered because we were in contact almost daily, and the standard allocation assumed a rate of engagement that bore no relationship to our actual situation. The depot was run by Adept Surat's staff, a group of Munitorum clerks and servitors who processed requisitions with the enthusiasm of men who'd been doing the same thing for decades, and would continue doing it until their augmetics failed and their bodies followed. I presented my requisition to a clerk who examined it, compared it to a table on his data slate, and told me that my allocation was correct and could not be adjusted. I argued. He cited regulations. I cited the enemy. He cited subsection 14, paragraph 9 of the Departamento Munitorum Field Supply Code, which stated that ammunition allocations were calculated based on unit strength at the time of deployment, adjusted quarterly for attrition, and could not be modified by field officers below the rank of captain. I was a lieutenant. The conversation was over, but I stayed in the depot. I had nowhere pressing to be for another hour, and after months of watching supplies arrive in the wake of dead officers, I wanted to understand how the machine that delivered them actually worked. So I found a crate to sit on near the processing station, in the manner of a man waiting out the cold, and I watched the clerks work the way I'd once watched a furnace through its cooling cycle, patiently, looking for the place where the pattern showed itself. It did not take long. A requisition came through on the cogitator bank that the senior clerk was monitoring, and his whole posture changed. He straightened up, adjusted his augmetic lenses, and began processing the form with a speed and attentiveness that he had not shown for any of the other requisitions in the queue. He called a second clerk over. They consulted briefly, checking something on a separate data slate, and then the senior clerk entered an authorization code and stamped the requisition approved. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. The rest of the queue had been moving at the pace of men who had nowhere to be for the next century. This one moved like it mattered, so I looked for where it went. The clerk crossed to the depot's filing system to log it, and I read the labels on the cabinets while he did, the way you read the markings on a furnace door to know what's behind it. Most were what you'd expect: ammunition, rations, medical, transport. But the cabinet the clerk opened was labeled Casualty-Linked Requisitions, Priority Processing. Casualty-linked. I'd never heard the term before. In the Guard, requisitions are categorized by type, not by cause. You don't file a request for power cells under "because people died." You file it under ammunition, standard, last type. Unless the deaths are the point of the requisition. I sat with that thought for a while, turning it over the way I'd turn a piece of clinker in my hands, feeling for the grain, looking for the fracture lines. Casualty-linked requisitions. Priority processing, a separate filing system, a separate authorization process, a clerk who snapped to attention when one came through as though it were a command from the colonel himself. I left the depot and went back to my position in the pass, and I didn't mention what I'd seen to anyone. But I started keeping a mental record of events, noting the timing of officer deaths against the timing of supply deliveries. I didn't write anything down. Writing things down in the Imperial Guard is how you create evidence, and evidence has a way of getting the person who created it killed faster than any enemy action. The correlation was undeniable. 3 days after a lieutenant in 7th Company was killed in a patrol ambush, a shipment of replacement flak armor arrived, enough to re-equip his entire platoon. 5 days after the sergeant major of 9th Company was executed by Commissar Sulo for insubordination, a consignment of medical supplies appeared in the battalion stores. A week after the last surviving original officer of 10th Company died of wounds received in a bombardment, 10th Company received a full resupply of ammunition, rations, and entrenching tools, the most complete delivery any unit in the battalion had seen in months. The pattern was obvious once you saw it. Death produced supplies, and the deaths that produced the most supplies were concentrated among officers, because the Departamento Munitorum valued officers more in death than it did in life. It was an economy. A closed system like a furnace cycle. Heat goes in, clinker comes out. Clinker is broken, furnace is restarted. Officers go in, officers die. Requisitions come out, supplies arrive, and the men who filed the requisitions are already looking for the next officer to feed into the system. In my 8th month on Hrothgal Minoris, the system reached up and touched me directly. Colonel Dravin called a command conference in the regimental headquarters, a fortified bunker complex built into the captured Hrekin fastness. I attended as the senior surviving officer of 8th Company, which tells you something about the state of the company's command structure. The conference was attended by every remaining company commander and senior officer in the regiment, perhaps 30 men and women in total, along with Commissar Sulo, Adept Surat, and Dravin himself.
Draven was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that fills a room. He had a voice that matched, deep and carrying, and he used it sparingly, which gave his words weight. He'd been the 47th's commanding officer since before our deployment to Hrothgal Minoris, and he was the only original senior officer still alive. I had not thought about that fact until I sat in that bunker, looking at him across a table spread with tactical maps. And once I thought it, I could not stop thinking it. Every other original officer was dead. Draven was alive. In a regiment where officer mortality was 100%, the colonel survived. The conference was about the next phase of the campaign. Divisional Command had ordered a push deeper into the mountains, targeting a series of renegade strongholds that our intelligence identified as command nodes for the enemy's guerrilla operations. The plan was ambitious. It required the 47th to split into 3 battle groups, each advancing along a separate valley toward a separate objective, converging on the enemy's central position from 3 directions simultaneously. It was tactically reasonable, the kind of plan that works on a map and kills in practice, because maps don't show the 1,000 things that go wrong when 3 columns try to coordinate in mountainous terrain with unreliable communications and an enemy who knows the ground better than you do. But it was the sort of plan that a colonel proposes when he needs to show his superiors that he's being aggressive, that he's taking the fight to the enemy, that results are forthcoming. It was a career plan as much as a battle plan. What caught my attention was the composition of the battle groups. Each one was commanded by a specific officer, and each one was assigned a specific route, and the routes were not equal. Battle Group Primus, commanded by Major Helk, was assigned the Western Valley, which was the widest, the most accessible, and the best suited to conventional advance. Battle Group Secundus, commanded by Captain Treth, was assigned the Central Valley, which was narrower and more difficult but had the benefit of air support from a Navy detachment operating in the region. Battle Group Tertius, commanded by me, was assigned the Eastern Valley. The Eastern Valley was the Grenthar Pass extended, the same narrow defile, the same ridge-flanked killing ground, the same terrain that I'd been fighting in for months and that had cost me men every single day, but deeper, longer, with less support, fewer reinforcements, and a longer supply line that ran back through territory that the enemy regularly contested. It was the hardest route by far, the one most likely to produce casualties, the one that any competent commander would have assigned to his strongest and best supplied force. Instead, it was assigned to me, a lieutenant commanding a battle group, not a major, not a captain. A lieutenant with a hodgepodge force assembled from the remnants of 3 shattered companies, undersupplied, understrength, and underexperienced. I looked across the table at Draven, and he looked back at me, and his expression told me nothing. Then I looked at Surat, who was sitting in the corner with his data slate, his augmetic lenses whirring as they focused on me, and his expression told me everything. I was being sent into the Eastern Valley to die, not because my death served a tactical purpose, but because my death would generate a requisition. A lieutenant's death, plus the associated casualties of the battle group, would produce a logistics package large enough to sustain the regiment for weeks. I was supply. I was ammunition counted in flesh instead of metal. I was a line item on Surat's data slate, an entry in the casualty-linked requisition file, a resource to be expended at the optimal moment for maximum logistical return. I accepted the assignment. I saluted. I left the bunker and walked back to my company's position in the cold mountain air. And I did what I had always done when I found myself inside a furnace that was getting too hot. I assessed the situation. I read the fractures. And I started looking for a way out that didn't involve my own combustion.
The plan was to send Battle Group Tertius into the Eastern Valley in 9 days. That gave me 9 days to understand the full scope of what was happening and decide what to do about it. Not a long time, but clinker-breakers learn to work fast. The furnace doesn't wait. I started with the records. As a battle group commander, however temporary and however doomed, I had access to the battalion's operational logs, the casualty reports, and the supply manifests. I went through them methodically, cross-referencing deaths with deliveries, plotting the timing, the quantities, the authorization codes. The picture that emerged was clearer and uglier than I'd expected. Every officer death in the 47th Morthaxian since our deployment to Hrothgal Minoris had been followed within 3 to 7 days by a targeted supply delivery. Every single one. The deliveries were authorized through a special requisition channel designated Priority Epsilon, a classification I'd never encountered in any standard Munitorum documentation. The requisitions were filed by Adept Surat, co-authorized by Colonel Draven, and processed through a logistics node in orbit that was separate from the standard supply chain. A shadow pipeline, running parallel to the official one, fed by death and dispensing in ammunition and rations what it collected in blood. But the deliveries weren't just correlated with the deaths. They were calibrated to them. The size of each delivery was proportional to the rank of the officer who died. A corporal's death generated a small package, basic ammunition and ration supplements. A sergeant's death generated a medium package, weapons, medical supplies, equipment. A lieutenant's death generated a large package, enough to sustain a battalion for a week. A captain's death generated a very large package, and a colonel's death, according to the scale I was able to reconstruct from the records, would generate what was classified as a full strategic resupply, enough to equip and sustain an entire regiment for a standard campaign quarter. The scale was precise, it was documented, it was intentional. And then I understood the thing that had bothered me since Bastion Ulmar, the small detail I'd filed away twice and never resolved. Surat's signature on my promotions. A Munitorum adept had no business co-signing a field promotion, and I'd known it, and it had nagged at me like a stone in a boot. Now I saw why. Every officer death produced 2 pieces of paper from the same desk. One was the Priority Epsilon requisition, the supply package drawn against the corpse. The other was the promotion order. The survivor moved up to fill the slot the corpse had left. Death, requisition, promotion. One event, 3 documents, all of them flowing through Surat's hands because Surat was the man who processed what the dead left behind. He hadn't co-signed my promotions because he had a say in who rose. He'd co-signed them because my rise and another man's death were the same transaction, entered in the same ledger, on the same line. I had been reading my own promotions as advancement. They were receipts, and the deaths that fed it were not accidents. I went back through the tactical records with new eyes, examining the specific circumstances of each officer's death. Lieutenant Halt, killed by a grenade during the Hrecken assault, had been ordered to position his command group at a specific location on the mountainside, a location that, according to the tactical assessment, was within the blast radius of a known enemy grenade position. The order came from Colonel Draven. Captain Sten, killed by a heavy stubber round in the opening minutes of the Hrecken battle, had been ordered to lead from the front of the column, a position of maximum visibility and maximum danger, by Colonel Draven. And it was not only 8th Company, a lieutenant in 7th, killed holding a position the maps had marked as untenable, the acting commander of 10th, sent to lead a patrol into a sector his own scouts had flagged as a kill zone. Every officer death, when you followed the order behind it, traced back to the same desk. Draven, every trail led back to Draven, and standing beside Dravin in every record, at every briefing, in every decision that sent an officer into the teeth of the enemy at the worst possible moment, was Commissar Sulo, whose job was to ensure that the orders were followed, and Adept Surat, whose job was to file the paperwork when they weren't followed anymore because the officer who received them was dead. 3 men, a colonel, a commissar, and a clerk, running an abattoir disguised as a regiment, feeding officers into the furnace to keep the supply lines burning. And me, the next piece of clinker to be broken. I had 9 days before the Eastern Valley assignment would kill me, and I spent the first of them considering my options with the same dispassion I'd bring to evaluating furnace conditions. Option 1. Report what I'd found to someone above Dravin. Regimental command reported to divisional, and divisional reported to sector command. But reporting required evidence. Evidence required documentation. Documentation required time I didn't have, and the chain of command was, by its nature, built to protect itself. A lieutenant accusing a colonel of systematically murdering officers was not a report. It was a suicide note with extra steps. The colonel had the commissar. The commissar had the authority to execute me for sedition before my report ever left the room. Option 1 was no option at all. Option 2. Refuse the assignment. Refuse to lead Battle Group Tertius into the Eastern Valley. This was even simpler than Option 1 in its outcome. Refusal of a direct order in the field was dereliction, punishable by summary execution. Commissar Sulo would put a bolt round through my skull, Surat would file my death as a combat casualty, and the requisition generated by a lieutenant's execution would arrive within the week. My refusal would feed the machine just as efficiently as my compliance. Option 2 was the same as Option 1, just faster. Option 3. Desert. Leave. Walk away from the regiment, from the war, from Hrothgal Minoris entirely. Except there was nowhere to go. The planet was a war zone. The enemy held the east, the mountains held the north and south, and the Guard held the west, and the Guard shot deserters with the same enthusiasm it shot the enemy. The only way off Hrothgal Minoris was on a transport ship, and transport ships required authorization, and authorization required the signature of my commanding officer, who was the man trying to kill me. Option 3 was a fantasy. Option 4, survive the Eastern Valley. Not avoid it, not escape it, but go into it and come out alive. Not because I was brave, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because survival was the only option left that didn't end with me dead, and my death being converted into ammunition for the men who killed me. I chose Option 4, and I chose something else, something that crystallized in my mind that night as I sat in my bunker going through the records one last time. I chose to confront Dravin, not to accuse him, not to threaten him, but to understand him, because the one thing that didn't make sense in the entire picture was why. Dravin was a colonel. He had the rank, the authority, the connections to have himself transferred, promoted, or reassigned. He didn't need to be on Hrothgal Minoris. He didn't need to be running this operation. So why was he here, presiding over a system that murdered his own officers for supply crates? I requested a meeting with the colonel the following morning. To my surprise, it was granted immediately. No delay, no questions, no intermediaries. A runner came to my position within an hour of my request and told me that Colonel Dravin would see me in his command bunker at noon. I cleaned my uniform as best I could, checked my sidearm out of habit rather than intent, and walked up to the Hrecken fastness. The command bunker was deep inside the mountain, in a section of tunnels that the engineering corps had reinforced and expanded. It was warmer than the surface positions, lit by lumen globes that cast a flat, yellowish light, and it smelled of recycled air and the chemical tang of water purification tablets. Draven's office was a carved-out chamber with a stone floor and metal walls bolted over the rock. A tactical map covered one wall. A desk occupied the center, covered in data slates and hard copy documents. And Draven sat behind it, looking at me with an expression that I couldn't read, though I tried. He was not alone. Commissar Sulo stood against the far wall, arms folded, his pale eyes fixed on me. Adept Surat sat in a corner, his data slate in his lap, his augmetic lenses already focused on my face. The three of them, together, waiting for me. They'd known I was coming. Not just that I'd requested the meeting, but why? Draven gestured to a chair in front of the desk. I sat down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Draven said, "You've been reading the supply manifests." It was not a question. I didn't treat it like one. "Yes, sir." "And the casualty reports?" "Yes, sir." "And you've drawn conclusions?" "Yes, sir." He looked at me for a long time, not with anger, not with threat, with something that, if I'd been a more sentimental man, I might have called weariness. Then he opened a drawer in his desk, took out a data slate, and slid it across to me. "Then you should see the rest of it," he said. The data slate contained a single document. It was an astropathic communique, dated 5 months prior to our deployment, from Sector Command's Departamento Munitorum, Regional Supply Authority, to the 47th Morthaxian's assigned logistics node. The language was dense with Munitorum jargon, but the core message was clear enough. Due to a major offensive in another sector, all standard supply allocations for forces deployed in the Hrothgal subsector were being suspended indefinitely. Resources were being redirected to support the offensive. Units already deployed in the Hrothgal subsector were to maintain operations with existing stocks and authorized emergency requisition channels only. Suspended indefinitely. Existing stocks. Emergency requisition channels only. I looked up from the data slate. Draven was watching me. "That order came down before we left Morthax," he said, "before we boarded the transports, before any of us set foot on Hrothgal Minoris. I was informed of it 3 days before deployment by Adept Surat, who received it through Munitorum channels. The 47th Morthaxian was being deployed to a war zone with no supply line, no ammunition resupply, no ration replenishment, no medical restocking, nothing. We were expected to fight a campaign with whatever we carried in our holds when we landed, and when that ran out, we were expected to die." He let that settle before he went on. "The regiments that had held this front through the long years of the war had supply dumps to fall back on, stockpiles deep enough to ride out a suspension and barely notice. We had nothing cached. We'd come off the transports into a 9-year war with a single deployment's worth of supply in our holds, and when those holds ran dry, there was nothing behind them. On paper, the order suspended the whole subsector. In practice, it fell hardest on the units with no reserve of their own, and none were greener than the 47th. The bunker was very quiet. I could hear the hum of the lumen globes and the distant muffled thump of artillery somewhere on the surface. "I petitioned for the deployment to be cancelled," Draven said. "The petition was denied. I petitioned for an alternative supply arrangement. The petition was denied. I petitioned for the regiment to be reassigned to the sector where the offensive was being conducted, where supply lines were active. The petition was denied. The 47th Morthaxian was on the deployment schedule, and the schedule had been approved by the Lord General Staff, and the Lord General Staff did not make errors. Our deployment was required by the strategic plan. The fact that the strategic plan would starve us to death was, in the language of the denial, A logistical challenge to be addressed by Field Command using authorized expedient methods. He paused. The weariness I'd sensed in his expression was in his voice now, thick and heavy as clinker. Adept Surat found the expedient method. Priority Epsilon, a provision buried deep in the Munitorum Field Supply Code, subsection 412, paragraph 31, clause 7. It states that in the event of supply line disruption, units may generate emergency requisitions linked to confirmed combat casualties, processed through a dedicated channel that bypasses the standard allocation system. The requisitions are fulfilled from strategic reserve stocks maintained at sector-level depots, stocks that are not subject to the same reallocation orders that suspended our regular supply. The channel was designed for units that had suffered catastrophic losses and needed immediate resupply to maintain combat effectiveness. It was never intended for sustained use. It was never intended to be the sole supply source for an entire regiment over an entire campaign. He stopped. Surat spoke for the first time, his voice thin and precise as a stylus scratching on parchment. The requisition scale is tiered by rank, Surat said. The loss of enlisted personnel generates minimal requisitions. Corporals and sergeants generate moderate requisitions. Officers of lieutenant rank and above generate substantial requisitions. The logic of the system is that higher-ranking casualties represent greater organizational damage and therefore require greater replacement resources. It is an efficient system. It is the only system available to us. I understood. I understood all of it, and I wished I didn't. They were not murdering officers for profit. They were not running a grift. They were not skimming supplies or enriching themselves. They were feeding officers into an emergency requisition system because that system was the only thing standing between the regiment and starvation. Every dead lieutenant meant food for 500 men for a week. Every dead captain meant ammunition for a month. Every death was a transaction and the currency was blood, and the goods purchased were survival. The colonel, the commissar, the clerk, they had built a machine for keeping people alive, and the fuel it burned was people. Why officers? I asked, though I already knew. Surat answered. The mathematics are straightforward. The death of a single lieutenant generates a supply package equivalent to the deaths of approximately 40 enlisted guardsmen. The operational impact of losing one lieutenant is manageable. The operational impact of losing 40 guardsmen is severe. The system incentivizes the sacrifice of higher-value casualties. It is, if I may say, elegantly designed, though I suspect the architects of the provision did not anticipate its application in this manner. Elegantly designed. I wanted to hit him, I didn't. Not because of restraint or discipline, but because hitting a Munitorum adept would accomplish exactly as much as hitting a furnace wall. The furnace doesn't feel it. The furnace doesn't care. The officers who died, I said, you chose them. Draven's jaw tightened. I chose the circumstances. I assigned them to positions of maximum risk. I structured operations to create situations where officer casualties were likely. I did not pull the trigger. The enemy did that. But I loaded the weapon and pointed it.
And Commissar Sulo?
Sulo spoke from his position against the wall, his voice as flat and even as it always was. I ensured compliance. Officers who questioned their assignments were disciplined. Officers who refused were executed. Their deaths served the same function, with the added benefit of maintaining unit discipline. Maintaining unit discipline. A euphemism for murder wrapped in the authority of the Commissariat, filed under acceptable operating procedure. How many? I asked. Surat consulted his data slate with the absent precision of a man checking the time. Since deployment, 63 officers of various ranks have been expended through Priority Epsilon requisitions. Their deaths have generated the supply packages that have sustained this regiment at operational capacity for the duration of the campaign. He looked up at me. Without priority Epsilon, the 47th Morthaxian would have exhausted its supplies in the 3rd week. Every soldier in this regiment who has eaten a meal, fired a last round, or received medical treatment in the past 8 months has done so because an officer died, and their death generated the requisition that provided those resources. 63 officers fed into a furnace to keep the regiment burning. 8 months of war, sustained by a shadow economy of calculated murder. The bunker was silent. I let the number settle. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Draven leaned forward. "Because I need you to walk into the Eastern Valley clear-headed. Not angry, not suspicious, not looking over your shoulder for the bolt round you think is coming. If you go in thinking you're being sacrificed, you'll fight like a man who's already dead, and dead men don't take objectives. The enemy's command infrastructure is in those mountains. If you break it, the war on Hrothgal Minoris ends. Supply lines reopen. Priority Epsilon stops. If you don't break it, this continues. More months, more officers, more requisitions." He paused. "I need you thinking about the enemy, Lieutenant, not about me." He had told me the truth because the truth served his purpose. I respected that more than any speech about duty or honor. "If I take the Eastern Valley and we break the enemy command structure," I said, "the war ends. Priority Epsilon stops." "That is the projection," Surat said. "And if I die in the valley?" "Then your death generates a lieutenant-grade requisition, and we assign the next qualified officer to the same objective, and we try again," Draven said. His voice was steady, his eyes were not. I stood up. "I'll need more ammunition than the standard allocation, significantly more. The Eastern Valley will chew through power cells faster than any engagement we've had on this planet." Surat's data slate was already in his hands. He scrolled through figures for a moment, his augmetic lenses clicking. "A lieutenant-grade pre-authorization based on projected casualties will generate enough for basic operational capacity. But the Eastern Valley terrain, the expected duration, the supply line exposure..." He looked up at Draven. "Basic operational capacity will result in ammunition rationing by day 4. If the battle group encounters heavy resistance, they will be firing on empty cells by day 6. Draven closed his eyes. When he opened them, the weariness was still there, but something harder had settled over it. "What would cover it?" he asked. "A captain-grade package combined with the pre-authorized lieutenant package would provide adequate supply margins for a campaign of up to 12 days, Surat said, the way he said everything. With numbers, with precision, without acknowledging what a captain-grade package required. The bunker had gone very still. "There are 3 acting captains remaining in the regiment," Draven said. "Not to me, not to Surat, not to anyone in particular, just into the air between us. Treth, who commands Battle Group Secundus, Vrene, who commands the reserve element, and Osk, who commands the logistics garrison. Treth and Vrene are essential to their operational assignments," Sulo said from the wall. "Their removal would compromise both battle groups." "Captain Osk," Surat said, and his voice had the quality of a cogitator printing a result, flat and mechanical and utterly devoid of the weight of what it carried, "commands a garrison of 50 soldiers guarding a supply depot that will be functionally redundant once battle group operations commence. His unit's tactical value to the campaign is minimal. His rank, however, generates a substantial requisition." Nobody said it. Nobody had to. Osk was a garrison commander. He was safe. He was behind the lines, guarding crates in a cave, and he would live through this campaign and go home to whatever world had made him unless someone decided that his death was worth more than his life. Draven looked at me. Not at Sulo, not at Surat, at me. "I won't make this decision for you," he said. "You're the one taking the Eastern Valley. You're the one whose men will run dry on day 6 if the supply margins aren't adequate. If you want the ammunition, you tell me. If you don't want it, you take what the lieutenant package provides and you manage." I knew what he was doing, and I made the choice anyway because the alternative was walking 460 people into a mountain range with enough power cells to last 4 days on a mission that would take 12. "Captain Osk's garrison," I said. "Redeploy them to forward reconnaissance in the Grenthar Pass approach. Full combat patrol, aggressive posture beginning at first light tomorrow." Draven nodded once. "Forward reconnaissance in contested territory. High-risk assignment. I'll sign the order."
The captain-grade requisition can be filed upon confirmation of casualties,
Surat said, already writing. "Supply packages will arrive within 72 hours, well within the pre-deployment timeline." I walked out of that bunker carrying more weight than I'd carried going in, and none of it was physical. Captain Osk died on the second day of his forward reconnaissance patrol. An enemy ambush in the lower pass, heavy weapons, prepared positions, the same kind of ambush that had killed dozens of officers before him in the same mountains, on the same trails, under the same gray sky. His garrison fought well. 38 of his 50 soldiers survived and were folded into the reserve pool. The casualty report was filed by Adept Surat. The captain-grade requisition was processed through Priority Epsilon. 3 days later, 12 crates of high-capacity power cells arrived at the Battle Group Tertius staging area, along with ammunition, medical supplies, and ration supplements sufficient for a 12-day mountain campaign. I checked the crates personally. I inventoried every cell, every ration pack, every bandage. I did it with the same methodical attention I'd once applied to checking my clinker-breaking tools before a furnace entry. And when I was done, I sat on one of the crates, and I felt the weight of a man I'd never met and never would, a captain named Osk, who was dead because I decided that my people needed his ammunition more than the Imperium needed his heartbeat. I prepared Battle Group Tertius for the Eastern Valley the way I'd prepare for a furnace entry. Check the equipment, check the men, read the conditions, plan the route. The battle group was 460 soldiers, remnants of 3 companies cobbled together into a fighting force that existed on paper as a coherent unit and in reality as a collection of strangers bound by nothing but shared exhaustion and a deployment order that pointed them east. I had 2 surviving sergeants I trusted, Brose Elim, who had been promoted from squad marksman to platoon sergeant on my recommendation and who accepted the rank with the same silence she applied to everything else, and a man named Tolvek, who had come to us from 12th Company and who had the look of someone who had stopped being surprised by bad situations so long ago that equanimity had become his default state. I briefed them on the objective. I did not brief them on Priority Epsilon. We stepped off at dawn 9 days after the conference, moving east through the Grenthar Pass and into the deeper valleys beyond. The terrain worsened immediately. The pass narrowed until it was barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast. The ridges above closed in like jaws. The enemy had seeded the approaches with mines and tripwires and deadfalls, and our advance slowed to a crawl as the sappers worked their way forward, clearing each hazard one at a time while the rest of us waited in single file, exposed and vulnerable, feeling the weight of the mountains pressing in on us from both sides. Contact came on the second day. A renegade ambush from the northern ridge, heavy weapons firing down into the column. We lost 18 men in the first 30 seconds. Not officers this time. Just soldiers, just people. I ordered the column into cover, such as it was, and sent 2 squads up the ridge facing a flanking action that cost another 6 men but silenced the ambush position. We recovered what ammunition we could from the dead, both ours and theirs, and kept moving. The valley deepened, the walls grew taller, the sky shrank to a narrow strip of gray above us, and the light took on the dim, filtered quality of deep hive levels. We fought our way through 3 more ambush positions over the next 4 days. Each one cost us men. Each one was set up with the precision of an enemy that knew the ground intimately and had years to prepare it. The renegades used the tunnels to appear behind us, above us, on flanks we thought were secure. They mined our supply routes as fast as we cleared them. They cut our communications with jamming that turned the Vox into static choked noise. And they fought with the desperation of men who had nowhere left to retreat to, because the deeper we pushed, the closer we came to the heart of their operation, and they knew it. The worst of the 4 ambushes came on the 3rd day, at a point where the valley floor dropped through a series of rock shelves, each one creating a natural step about 2 meters high. Natural choke points. The enemy had pre-registered mortar coordinates on each shelf, and when our lead elements climbed down the first one, the barrage started. Accurate, concentrated, the kind of fire that turns a formation into a scattering of isolated individuals hugging whatever cover they can find, which in this case was the rock shelves themselves, which meant climbing down into the beaten zone to get behind them. I lost a full squad on that first shelf, 12 soldiers, gone in a span of seconds that felt like something much longer. Tolvek pulled the column into a covered position along the valley wall, while I tried to raise the rear echelon on the Vox for our own mortar support. But the jamming was thick, and the signal broke apart into noise before it reached anyone who could help. We spent 3 hours pinned on those shelves while the enemy walked mortar fire back and forth across us, adjusting after each volley, tightening the pattern the way a craftsman tightens a noose. By the time it ended, the 12 from that first shelf had become 28. I couldn't get them out. I couldn't suppress the mortars. I couldn't do anything except sit behind a rock ledge and listen to the explosions and the screaming and count the pauses between volleys and try to predict where the next one would land. Bros Elim solved it. She'd been moving during the barrage, which was either the bravest or the most insane thing I'd seen anyone do on Hrothgal Minoris. While the rest of us pressed ourselves flat against whatever cover we could find, she climbed. She went up the valley wall, hand over hand, finding grips in the rock face that I couldn't see from below, pulling herself up through a crack in the stone that was barely wide enough for her shoulders. She climbed until she was above the mortar positions, on a ledge that gave her a clear line of sight to the enemy's forward observer, the man who was directing the fire. One shot from the long lass, she'd stripped off a dead marksman on the valley floor 2 days earlier, one of the uncounted bodies the mountains had collected over 9 years of war, and the observer dropped. The mortars kept firing, but without correction, the rounds went wide, and we moved. We cleared the shelves. We kept going. And Bros climbed back down and rejoined the column without a word, because that was who she was. On the 5th day, one of my remaining sergeants, a Morthaxian named Narth, who'd been competent and steady throughout the advance, stepped on a pressure mine hidden under loose shale. The mine took his legs below the knees. He lived for 4 hours while our medic worked on him, conscious for most of it, gripping the hand of the guardsman nearest to him, with a force that left bruises. He died when the bleeding wouldn't stop. I wrote his name in my report and felt the familiar, cold weight of another man's death added to the pile. And I knew with a clarity that cut like a bayonet that Narth's death would generate a sergeant-grade priority, Epsilon requisition back at regimental command, and that within a week His life would be converted into medical supplies and ration packs, and the regiment would eat, and nobody except me and 3 other men would ever know the transaction had occurred. That knowledge sat inside me like a hot coal, not burning, just there, constant, inescapable. On the 8th day, we broke through. The valley opened into a wide mountain basin, ringed by peaks, with a river running through its center and a complex of structures built into the far mountain wall. This was the enemy's command center. Intelligence had called it Bastion Revec, a name that probably had some significance in the local dialect that I neither knew nor cared about. What I cared about was the fortifications. Walls, gun emplacements, communication towers, a landing pad for light aircraft, storage bunkers, barracks. It was a small city dug into the rock, fortified over 9 years, and defended by what our scouts estimated at the better part of 1,000 renegade troops. I had 312 soldiers left. The assault on Bastion Revec lasted 2 days. I will not describe every hour of it. There are limits to what description can convey, and the fighting in that basin pushed against those limits and broke through them the way our troops broke through the outer defenses, messily and at great cost. I will tell you the things that matter. Tolvek led the first assault on the outer wall and took it, losing 1/3 of his platoon in the process. He took a last bolt through the shoulder during the breach and kept fighting with his arm hanging useless at his side, firing his last pistol left-handed until a medic tackled him behind a wall section and tied off the bleeding. He refused evacuation. I didn't argue. I needed him. Bros Ilim positioned herself on a rocky outcrop above the basin with the long las, and spent the entire assault providing precision fire that was, by any reasonable standard, the single most effective weapon system in my battle group. I counted her shots for about an hour before I lost track. Every shot connected. Every shot dropped a target. She lay on that rock for 2 days without moving, without eating, without sleeping, and when it was over, she climbed down with the long las slung across her back and said nothing because Bros Elim never said anything, and by that point, her silence was the most eloquent statement in the regiment. We took the command center on the evening of the 2nd day. The final push was through the tunnel network beneath the main complex, close quarters fighting in the dark with lasguns and bayonets, and, in a few desperate stretches, bare hands and entrenching tools. The renegade commander, a former PDF colonel who'd turned to the ruinous powers for reasons that probably made sense to him and made no sense to anyone else, made his stand in the central command bunker with what was left of his personal guard. We cleared it the way we'd cleared every chamber before it. Grenades through the firing slit and bayonets for whatever was still moving when the smoke thinned. He was among the dead when we counted them, identifiable only by the rank markings on what was left of his armor. His command structure died with him in that bunker, and the renegade resistance in the eastern mountains shattered within days as unit after unit lost coordination and began surrendering or scattering. Battle Group Tertius took Bastion Revec with 312 soldiers. 189 of them were still alive when the fighting ended. 123 were not. The Eastern Valley had swallowed them the way it swallowed everything, quietly and completely, and the mountains closed over them and the war moved on. I submitted my battle report from the ruins of the command center, sitting at the dead renegade colonel's desk, using his own cogitator because ours had been destroyed in the fighting. The Vox was working again, now that the enemy's jamming equipment was in pieces, and I transmitted the report to regimental command, along with a casualty list, a supply status, and a request for immediate resupply and medical evacuation for the wounded. The response came within the hour. Colonel Draven, his voice heavy with something I chose to interpret as relief, confirmed that Battle Group Secundus had taken its objective at lower cost, and that Battle Group Primus had taken its own, though Major Helk had been killed leading the final push on the western strongpoints. Even the easy route, it turned out, had a price. The enemy's command infrastructure in the eastern mountains was effectively destroyed. Organized resistance on Hrothgal Minoris was collapsing. The campaign was entering its final phase. He also informed me that I was being promoted to captain, effective immediately, in recognition of the successful operation. The promotion order bore the usual 2 signatures, Draven's and Surat's. There had been 1 captain's vacancy in the regiment to promote me into, and I had made it myself in the Grenthar approach the week before the advance. I was being given Osk's rank. The same death that emptied the chair beneath me had filled the crates I carried up the valley. Rank and ammunition, both drawn against 1 corpse, and the corpse was one I had chosen. I did not let myself follow the thought any further than that. That evening, in the ruins of the command center, I wrote my recommendations for commendations and promotions within Battle Group Tertius, the standard post-engagement procedure. List the soldiers who performed above expectations, recommend them for recognition, file the paperwork so that the Munitorum could process their advancement, and the regiment could rebuild its shattered command structure. Brose Elim's name should have been at the top of that list. She had single-handedly broken the mortar ambush in the pass. She had provided precision overwatch for the entire Bastion Ravec assault, 2 days without rest, without food, firing with an accuracy that had saved dozens of lives. By any rational measure, she had earned a commission, a field promotion to officer rank, Lieutenant Ilim. It was the obvious recommendation, the deserved recommendation. I didn't write it. I left her name off the officer promotion list and recommended her for a unit commendation instead, a certificate that carried no change in rank and no change in her designation within the Munitorum's files. I did this because I knew what officer rank meant in the 47th Morthaxian. A sergeant generated a requisition like everyone else, and shared the same blunt danger every soldier in the regiment shared, the danger of being in the wrong place when the enemy's guns found it. But a sergeant was not hunted. The scheme spent commissioned officers, lieutenants, and above, because that was where the packages turned from useful to decisive, and that was the tier Draven shaped his operations to feed. The moment Brose Elim became Lieutenant Elim, she stopped being a soldier who might die and became a resource worth arranging the death of. She became, in the cold arithmetic of Surat's data slate, more valuable dead than alive. Sergeant Ilim was a skilled shooter the war might kill. Lieutenant Ilim was a logistics opportunity the regiment would. I kept her safe by keeping her low, by refusing to reward the best soldier I'd ever served with, because the reward would paint a target on her that she would never see and I could never explain. The weeks that followed the fall of Bastion Ravec were a blur of mop-up operations, prisoner processing, and the slow, grinding bureaucracy of a campaign transitioning from active combat to occupation. The renegade forces disintegrated. Some surrendered. Some fled into the deep mountains. Some fought to the death in isolated pockets that took days to root out. But the war, in any meaningful strategic sense, was over. Hrothgal Minoris was being pacified, and the 47th Morthaxian, what was left of it, was being consolidated at the Hrecken fastness to await reassignment. It was during this period that the supply convoy arrived. I remember the day because it was the first day on Hrothgal Minoris that I didn't hear gunfire. Not distant thunder, not the muffled crump of artillery, not the sharp crack of las fire from the perimeter. Nothing. Just wind and silence and the sound of men moving through a camp that was, for the first time in 11 months, not under threat. The convoy came in from orbit, 6 heavy landers packed with supplies, not priority Epsilon emergency packages, but real supplies, full logistics train material, crated ammunition in standard quantities, ration pallets in regulation packaging, medical supplies in sealed containers, equipment spares, replacement uniforms, hygiene kits, even a crate of recreational items, playing cards and bound text stories, and a portable holoprojector with a library of approved Munitorum entertainment programs. The kind of supply delivery that a properly supported regiment receives as a matter of course, and that we hadn't seen since before we landed on this rock. Supplies were reaching us again. I assumed at the time that the sector offensive that had supposedly drained our allocation was finally over, or reprioritized, or reorganized, or whatever word the Munitorum used when they remembered that an entire regiment existed and might need food and ammunition to keep existing. I was wrong about the reason, though I would not learn how wrong until later. In that moment, the reason did not matter. What mattered was simpler. Priority Epsilon was no longer necessary. The shadow pipeline could shut down. The furnace could cool. But the convoy carried more than supplies. It carried passengers. And among those passengers was a man whose presence changed everything I thought I knew about what had happened on Hrothgal Minoris. His name was Senior Auditor Prael Hasik of the Departamento Munitorum Divisional Compliance Bureau. He was a small, neat man with a shaved head and an augmetic eye that gleamed like a polished coin in a face otherwise remarkable only for its absolute lack of expression. He wore Munitorum robes of a quality that suggested seniority, and he carried a document case that he clutched the way guardsmen clutch their weapons, reflexively and with the ingrained certainty that letting go would be fatal. Hasik was an auditor. He had been sent to review the 47th Morthaxian's operational records as part of a routine compliance assessment triggered by the campaign's conclusion. Every regiment that completes a deployment undergoes a records review. Casualty reports, supply manifests, operational logs, promotion orders, disciplinary actions. The Munitorum checks the paperwork to ensure that the paperwork was done correctly because in the Imperium of Man, the manner of your death matters less than whether it was properly documented. Hasik set up his operations in a requisitioned tent next to the regimental command bunker, and over the course of the following week, he went through every record the 47th Morthaxian had generated during 11 months of war on Hrothgal Minoris. Every requisition, every casualty report, every promotion order, every priority Epsilon filing. I watched the process from a distance, the way you watch a crack propagating through furnace lining. Slowly at first, then faster, then all at once. Hasik requested files. Hasik cross-referenced files. Hasik summoned clerks, reviewed authorization codes, compared serial numbers, and made notes in a private journal that he permitted no one else to see. His augmetic eye whirred and clicked as it scanned page after page of data, and his expression never changed, not once, throughout the entire process. On the 8th day, Hasik summoned Colonel Draven, Commissar Sulo, Adept Surat, and me to a meeting in his tent. He did not explain why I was included. I assumed it was because I was the senior surviving line officer, and the records showed my name on every operation from the Kolthrenen Plateau to Bastion Revek. I walked in expecting a commendation, or at worst, a reprimand for some procedural violation I'd committed during the campaign. What I got was neither. Hasik sat behind a folding table covered in data slates and hard copy printouts. He looked at each of us in turn, his augmetic eye settling on each face with a precision that felt like the calibration of a targeting system. Then he opened his document case, removed a single sheet of parchment, and placed it on the table between us.
This, he said, is the original supply suspension order for the Hrothgal subsector, transmitted 5 months prior to the 47th Morthaxian's deployment. Authorization code Gamma 77 Corin, issued by the Regional Supply Authority, suspending all standard allocations for forces deployed in the subsector. Draven nodded. His face was stone. I'm familiar with it. I'm certain you are, Hasik said. His voice had no temperature. It was neither warm nor cold, neither sympathetic nor accusatory. It was the voice of a system performing its function. I have spent the past week reviewing this order in context with the 47th Morthaxian's operational records, priority Epsilon requisitions, and the sector-level distribution logs maintained by the Regional Supply Authority. He paused. The tent was silent except for the hum of a portable lumen strip and the distant sound of camp activity.
The suspension order was issued in error.
Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I'm not sure anyone breathed. The authorization code Gamma 77 Corin was assigned to the Hrothgal subsector supply allocation, but the original suspension directive from Sector Command specified authorization code Gamma 77 Corum, which corresponds to the Hrenith subsector supply allocation, 4 sectors distant. The Hrenith subsector was the operational zone for the major offensive that necessitated supply reallocation. The Hrothgal subsector, where the 47th Morthaxian was deployed, was not included in the reallocation directive. Your standard supply allocation was never intended to be suspended. He delivered this information the way Surat delivered logistics reports, with numbers, with precision, with the absolute neutrality of a man for whom the content of the information was less important than its accuracy. The error occurred at the transcription level, Hasik continued. A clerk at the Regional Supply Authority mistyped a single character in the authorization code when processing the directive. Corin instead of Corim. The substitution was not flagged by the verification system because both codes were valid, corresponding to active subsectors with active deployments. The error propagated through the distribution network without challenge. Your supply allocation was suspended. Your standard requisitions were rerouted to a holding queue at Depot Sigma Aurelian, where they accumulated unfulfilled for the duration of your deployment. He consulted a notation in his document case. The clerk in question, one Scrivener 3rd Class Powell Devek, was subsequently awarded a commendation for processing efficiency during the quarter in which the error was made. His output metrics for that period were among the highest in the department. The commendation remains on his record. A commendation. The man whose pen stroke killed 64 officers received a commendation for the speed at which he did it. He reached into his document case and produced a second sheet. A manifest. It listed quantities, categorized by type, dated and stamped with depot insignia. The supplies requisitioned by the 47th Morthaxian through standard channels over the past 11 months total approximately 8,200 metric tons of material, including ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and equipment. This material was received by Depot Sigma Aurelian, logged into the holding queue, and stored in a warehouse awaiting resolution of what the depot staff classified as a routing anomaly. The anomaly was never investigated because the depot's standing operating procedure assigns routing anomalies a priority classification of tertius low, which carries an estimated resolution timeline of 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24 months. The supplies had been there the whole time, sitting in a warehouse 4 sectors away because a clerk wrote Corin instead of Corim, and nobody in the system cared enough to check. The 47th Morthaxian's standard supply allocation was never suspended, Hasik repeated, as though the fact needed to be stated twice to achieve its full weight. The supplies were available, they were funded, they were manufactured,
transported, and delivered to the appropriate depot. They were not distributed due to a single-character transcription error in an authorization code. I looked at Draven. The colonel was sitting very still, his hands flat on his knees, his face the color of old ash. He was looking at the manifest on the table, at the numbers that represented 8,200 metric tons of supplies that had been available to his regiment for 11 months, while he and I, between us, had murdered 64 of our own officers to generate emergency requisitions for a fraction of that amount. I looked at Surat. The Adept's augmetic lenses were fixed on the data, clicking rapidly as they zoomed and focused. His mouth was slightly open, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked like a man rather than a machine. A small, old, horrified man. I looked at Sulo. The commissar had not moved. His arms were still folded. His pale eyes were fixed on the far wall of the tent. He might have been carved from stone, except that a vein in his temple was pulsing, fast and irregular. 64 officers. Hundreds of priority Epsilon requisitions, 11 months of calculated murder, of engineered casualties, of deaths planned and plotted and failed and processed and approved. All of it. Every body, every funeral, every name scratched off the roster, and every promotion handed to the next man in line. All of it because a clerk 4 sectors away wrote Corin instead of Corim. Hasik gathered his documents, replaced them in his case, and closed it with a click that sounded in that silent tent like a cell door shutting. "The transcription error has been corrected," he said. "Standard supply allocations for the Hrothgal subsector have been restored, retroactive to the original deployment date. The accumulated supplies at Depot Sigma Aurelian will be released and distributed according to updated requisition schedules." He paused, and for the first time something that might have been human entered his voice. "The matter of the priority Epsilon requisitions and their associated casualties will be referred to the Divisional Compliance Bureau for assessment. You will be notified of the Bureau's findings in due course." He stood up. He gathered his case. He walked out of the tent. And the 4 of us, the colonel and the commissar and the clerk and the clinker-breaker, sat in the silence he left behind, and nobody said a word, because there were no words in Low Gothic or High Gothic or any language spoken by the billion worlds of the Imperium that could contain what we were feeling. Draven broke first. Not visibly, not the way you'd notice if you didn't know what to look for. But I saw it, the way I'd see a fracture line running through what looked like solid clinker, invisible to anyone who didn't spend their life reading stress patterns. Something behind his eyes shifted, some load-bearing structure gave way, and the man who had held the 47th together through 11 months of war by feeding it the blood of its own officers sagged in his chair like a furnace wall losing its integrity. He didn't speak. He stood slowly the way old men stand when their bodies have stopped cooperating with their intentions. He put on his cap. He straightened his jacket. And he walked out of the tent without looking at any of us. Sulo followed him, 2 paces behind, the commissar's hand resting on his bolt pistol out of habit rather than intent. The gesture looked different now. Everything looked different now. Surat and I were left alone in the tent. The adept sat with his data slate on his knees, but for the first time since I'd known him, he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at his hands. They were trembling, a fine, rapid vibration that made his fingers blur at the edges. "The variance," he said very quietly, almost to himself, "between Corin and Corim is a single glyph in standard Munitorum encoding. The 2 codes are identical but for the final character. In a clerk's hand, worked at speed, an N and an M are separated by a single leg of the pen, 1 downstroke completed instead of 2. The difference is approximately 2 millimeters of ink on parchment. 2 millimeters. 64 men and women dead because a pen moved 2 millimeters in the wrong direction on a page that no one ever looked at twice. I left Surat in the tent. He was still staring at his hands when I walked out. The Divisional Compliance Bureau assessed the matter. Their assessment took 11 days. The report, which I was permitted to read as the regiment's senior surviving line officer, was 51 pages long and written in the dense, recursive language of Munitorum administrative review. I read every page. Most of it was procedural analysis, evaluating whether the correct forms had been used, whether the authorization codes had been properly applied, whether the filing protocols for priority epsilon requisitions had been followed according to the relevant subsections of the Field Supply Code. The conclusion, buried in the final paragraph of the 51st page, stated the following: that the 47th Morthaxian Line Infantry had operated within the authorized parameters of Priority Epsilon Emergency Requisition Protocol, that the commanding officer, Colonel Draven, had exercised legitimate command discretion in the allocation of tactical assignments that resulted in officer casualties, that the Commissariat representative, Commissar Sulo, had performed his duties in accordance with the Commissariat Code of Conduct, that the Departamento Munitorum liaison, Adept Surat, had processed all requisitions in compliance with established filing procedures, and that the original transcription error that triggered the supply suspension was classified as an administrative variance within acceptable tolerances and required no further action beyond the correction already implemented. Administrative variance within acceptable tolerances. That was the official judgment on 64 lives. Not murder, not negligence, not even an error worth investigating. A variance. The kind of word you use for a slight wobble in a production output, a minor deviation in a manufacturing specification. The dead were not victims. They were a variance, absorbed by the system, processed, and filed. Captain Osk was a variance. The man I chose, the man I sent into the Grenthar approach, knowing what it would generate, the man whose death put power cells in the hands of my soldiers for the Bastion Ravec assault. He was a variance within acceptable tolerances. And if I had known, if any of us had known, that 8,200 metric tons of supplies sat in a warehouse 4 sectors away waiting for a routing number to be corrected, Osk would be alive, and I would not have his weight on me. And the power cells his death purchased would have arrived through a crate with a standard shipping label instead of through a requisition filed over his corpse. Nobody was punished. Nobody was disciplined. Nobody was even formally reprimanded. The transcription error was corrected. The supplies were released. The records were updated. And the 47th Morthaxian was listed in the Compliance Bureau's fields as a regiment that had demonstrated resourcefulness in adverse logistical conditions, which I suppose was one way of describing what we'd done. Draven submitted his resignation from command 3 days after the Compliance Bureau's report was finalized. It was not accepted. Resignation from active command during wartime required approval from Sector Command, and Sector Command had other things to do, presumably involving authorization codes that somebody needed to double-check. Instead, Draven was informed that his request would be processed through standard channels with an estimated resolution timeline of 12 to 18 months. He didn't wait 12 to 18 months. On the morning of the 4th day after the report, I was summoned to the command bunker by a runner whose face told me everything before he spoke. Colonel Draven was sitting at his desk, slumped forward slightly, his service pistol in his right hand and a hole in his temple that had already stopped bleeding by the time I arrived. The bunker was quiet. The lumen globes hummed. The tactical map still hung on the walls, marked with phase lines and objective designations that no longer mattered, because the war was over and the man who'd fought it was dead. His campaign journal was open on the desk, not to the last entry, the one the Commissariat would later find and file. I saw what was on the pages before that entry, because I was the first person through the door and I had a few minutes alone with him before the medici and the provosts arrived. Page after page, in a hand that grew less steady as it progressed, he had written names. Just names. No ranks, no dates, no circumstances. Just the names of every officer he had chosen to feed to Priority Epsilon, listed in order, from first to last. 64 names, not 63. The last name on the list, written in letters that shook and blurred at the edges, was his own. The final line beneath the names was the one the Commissariat found. They were my responsibility. All of them. The Commissariat ruled the death as a result of weapons malfunction. Accidental discharge during routine maintenance. A weapons malfunction that somehow required the colonel to point the weapon at his own temple and pull the trigger while sitting at his desk with his journal open. But the Commissariat had its own filing procedures, and the filing procedures said weapons malfunction, and that was that. I said nothing to contradict the ruling. Draven had chosen his exit the way he'd chosen everything else, with calculation, with purpose, and with the understanding that the system would process his death the way it processed all deaths, as data to be categorized and filed. I would not give the system the satisfaction of calling it what it was. Commissar Sulo requested reassignment. His request, unlike Draven's resignation, was processed efficiently. The Commissariat has its own channels, its own bureaucracy, its own mechanisms for moving its people where they need to be. Sulo was transferred to a penal legion operating in the southern hemisphere of Hrothgal Minoris, overseeing the pacification of renegade holdouts in the coastal regions. A penal legion, the unit where the most dangerous, the most expendable, and the most morally compromised soldiers in the Imperial Guard are sent. I don't know if Sulo requested the assignment specifically or if the Commissariat chose it for him. I don't know if it was punishment or penance or simply the path of least bureaucratic resistance. What I know is that Sulo walked out of the camp one morning with his kit bag and his bolt pistol, boarded a transport, and vanished into the war, and I never saw him again. Surat stayed. Of course he stayed. Munitorum adepts don't transfer. They're assigned to a unit and they stay with that unit until the unit is disbanded or the adept dies, whichever comes first. Surat continued to manage the 47th's logistics, processing the new supply deliveries with the same precise, mechanical efficiency he'd applied to the Priority Epsilon requisitions. He never mentioned the transcription error. He never mentioned the 64. He processed the incoming supplies, updated the manifests, balanced the ledgers. And if his hands still trembled when he worked, he hid it well enough that I couldn't see it from across the room. I inherited the regiment. The promotion came through on the day of Draven's death, filed by the divisional command staff, who needed someone in charge of the 47th immediately. With Helk dead in the western strongpoints, the regiment's surviving senior officers were 3 captains, and of the 3, I was the one who had taken the enemy's command and ended the war. The list did not require much deliberation. Captain Raddow became Colonel Raddow in the time it took a clerk servitor to stamp a data slate. The 5th promotion, the 5th dead man's rank, worn by a clinker-breaker from Morthax Secundus, who'd never wanted to be a corporal, let alone a colonel. And there was a moment, standing in that command bunker with Draven's blood still staining the wall behind the desk, when I understood the one thing that 11 years of clinker-breaking had never taught me. You can read a furnace perfectly. You can know every crack, every stress line, every pocket of trapped heat. None of it matters if the furnace was built wrong. If the specifications were written by someone who never stood inside one and never will. You can't break the furnace. The furnace is the system, and the system doesn't have cooling cycles. I took command of the 47th Morthaxian. I sat at Draven's desk, which became my desk, in Draven's bunker, which became my bunker. I picked up his campaign journal, closed it, and put it in a drawer. I looked at the tactical maps on the wall, the supply manifests on the desk, the blinking cursor of the command cogitator waiting for input. I looked at all of it, and I felt the furnace around me, vast and hot and running on a schedule that had nothing to do with the men inside it. Then I picked up the first requisition form, filled it out correctly, signed it with my new rank, and started my shift. Guardsmen tell a story. Somewhere deep in the Imperial Palace on Terra, in a chamber where even the light of the Astronomicon doesn't reach, there is a room of shelves holding the records of every soldier who ever served. At the end of each day, a servitor removes the files of the dead, incinerates them, and the ashes are converted into material for new shelves. The dead become the structure that holds the records of the living, who will become the dead, who will become shelves. An endless cycle. I don't know if the story is true. I don't think it matters whether it is. What matters is that 64 men and women of the 47th Morthaxian Line Infantry are dead because 2 millimeters of ink fell on the wrong side of a pen stroke, and the system that killed them has classified their deaths as an acceptable variance, and the war goes on, and the furnace goes on, and the clinker builds, and nobody is coming to break it. I am Colonel Hurn Raddow. 5th promotion. 11 months on Hrothgal Minoris. 64 ghosts in my chain of command, one of them put there by my own hand, and 8,200 metric tons of supplies sitting in a warehouse 4 sectors away, untouched, undelivered, unneeded. Because by the time anyone found them, the blood had already paid for everything we required. The most horrific way to be promoted in the Imperial Guard is not the bolt round that kills the man above you. It's not the battlefield, the trenches, the shelling, the bayonet charge, the close quarters fighting in the dark. It's not even the deliberate, calculated murder of your commanding officers to feed a requisition system that keeps the regiment alive. The most horrific way to be promoted is to discover, after all the blood and all the death, and all the carefully engineered casualties, that none of it was necessary, that the system that demanded the sacrifice was operating on a lie, that the lie was not malice, not conspiracy, not corruption, but a simple, stupid 2-millimeter error that nobody caught because nobody looked, and then to be handed the rank anyway, and told to continue. The Emperor protects. The paperwork is filed. The furnace does not cool.